Good evening. Good evening. This is perhaps the easiest and the best part of the program, and I'm really pleased to have had an opportunity to listen to some of the papers. Wonderful work. My name is Carole Boyce Davies, and I'm pleased to moderate this closing session. We are fortunate in that we were able to get Dr. Zeleza to be part of the discussion. Welcome, Paul, and happy birthday. My encounters with Paul Zeleza are at least 30 years, my goodness. When I was a director of African Studies, African Diaspora Studies at Florida International University, our program invited him to give a lecture on African history. So I was pleased and surprised when one day, soon after arriving at Howard last year, I saw him and Cassandra at the Howard University bookstore and realized we were fortunately going to be in the same institution. And this is something that, as you know, those of you who are positioned, as I have been, many different locations, that it's a joy when you are able to work in the same locational, institutional context with somebody whose work you admire. So I'm really happy about this. As it happens, a grad student was the one who pointed me to Paul Zeleza's work, noting my work on African diaspora studies, and wanted to invite him, which we did. Since then, particularly, his famous essay, Rewriting the African Diaspora Beyond the Black Atlantic, African Affairs 2005, has been a staple in most of my graduate classes in the early theoretical portion, particularly courses such as African diaspora texts and theories. But I've been informed as well by his scholarship on African gender issues. And I want to stress for you all, in my early years as a scholar, I want particularly the women in the audience to not take this for granted. In my early years as a scholar, right here at Howard University, when we got up and actually tried to articulate anything that had to do with women, we were shouted and shut down. So it was a labor of love to encounter the work of Paul Zeleza, who in those major essays on African gender studies actually cleared a lot of the conceptual ground and space that then makes African women's history come alive in the dynamic ways that it is now used by scholars in the academy. So I want us not to ever take that for granted, that the work of clearing that ground has been fundamental to our ability to do this kind of work. So generally, for many of us then, it's a joy when we have a male colleague who is already doing that work, and that's Paul Zeleza. So his essays such as Gendering African History, that major review of major texts by white women scholars, which often left African women out, claiming they could not find scholars to write or study that material, or stayed in very limited rural areas in looking at African studies, and did not go beyond current limitations of geography, assumed US Euro transcendence on these issues, was really fundamentally part of that early Gendering African History essay that Paul wrote, that review of those 4 major texts. And then the other major text, Gender Biases in African Historiography, in the collection edited by Oyeronke Oyewumi, talks about the invisible woman, absent and few notables often that repeat themselves in many texts. The notable absences, even in Rodney's, and I was really taken by that, Walter Rodney's classic 1982, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in which 6 out of 312 pages were the only places where you can find any reference to women. And the question, of course, we will talk about this as we go forward, but the educational paradigm is to blame clearly in the way that a scholar as brilliant as Walter Rodney would have been oriented. And then finally, his major work as a member of the UN Research Institute for Social Development, which produced amazing gender equality report, which I found so informative in my own recent work that had to do with African women's political leadership in Africa and in the African diaspora. Still African leadership, he argues in a really lovely piece that I shared with Amina last night, with looking at Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, while it's more advanced, and I have said this in my own work, more advanced than the United States, we have to repeat that. The paradigms are more advanced than in the United States. It is more frequent than that you will find women in those major leadership positions than you will find them anywhere else. These, still he argues, there are too sporadic, too singular, and a continent, quote, he uses the word, the phrase ruined by men, which is language also used by several African feminist activists that I've met over the years around the continent. So we are pleased to engage his work via conversation this evening with my friend and colleague Amina, who I met via Feminist Africa initially. Her work really significantly there. Amina Mama is a Nigerian-British academic. She holds a PhD in organizational psychology from the University of London's Birkbeck College and works as a transdisciplinary feminist educator, researcher, and organizer. She's currently a professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of California, Davies. Mama's most influential books are Beyond the Masks, Race, Gender, and Subjectivity, Routledge, 1995, and Engendering African Social Sciences, co-edited with Fatou Sow and Aisha Imam Kodeshri in 1997. And she's just returned from a major conference on Fatou Sow in Dakar. She has 40 years of experience working with African and transnational women's movements and developing feminist studies curricula at universities in Africa, Europe, and the USA. She served as a Kwame Nkrumah Chair in African Studies, University of Ghana, Legon, 2020-2022. She served 20 years as the founding editor of the digital gender studies journal Feminist Africa and co-produced 2 documentary films, The Witches of Gambaga, 2011, and The Art of Amataidu, 2014, which I was pleased to also be interviewed for and reference Ama's work in that film, with Ghanaian filmmaker Yaba Badoe. Amina continues to pursue her interests in activism through writing, collaborative action, research documentation, and film projects. And since we know we are at the end and we know there's a wonderful reception after, we are planning to keep this really tightly for 45 minutes, and we'll stop just before 6, perhaps. So I turn it over to Amina Mama to ask the first question. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and well done for keeping up with a long day. So we started at 8 this morning. It is my pleasure to be here this evening with you, and especially great pleasure to be able to have a chat, which I hope will also involve you. We don't want to just talk to ourselves. I want this to be an extended conversation. And to give you the opportunity to hear back from the man we've been talking about for the last 2 days, who's been having to listen and listen and listen, quietly sitting there listening. But we wanted to actually make sure that he did have a voice and did speak in this forum. So that's also the purpose of this fireside chat. A chance to talk to the man behind the myth, this vast, prolific legacy across disciplines, across fields, but we want to hear from you, Paul. So I'm going to start with a sort of historical question. I think I'm really interested in the intellectual history, how you lived your life and how that informed your ideas. Your career has spanned Africa, where it began, North America, both Canada and the USA, and a brief foray into the Caribbean, to the University of West Indies, very early in your career. And your formative years, of course, were in the formerly colonized parts of southern Africa, what used to be Rhodesia and Nyasaland, now Zimbabwe and Malawi. But the question I have for someone who's traveled as far and wide as you is, what were the concerns that initially motivated you to pursue African history and to actually stay throughout your career entirely focused on the African world, the African continent and its diaspora?
Good evening. First of all, let me thank the organizers of this conference. I think all of us will agree they did a fantastic job. So let's give them a hand. And secondly, I want to thank all the presenters. Again, I'm sure you're going to agree with me that we have been given an intellectual feast over the last 2 days. Absolutely brilliant presentations. So let's give a hand to all the presenters. And of course, we have also been well fed. And I would like to thank the people who've been preparing the food and making sure that behind the scenes, everything went smoothly. So let's give them a hand. I feel very privileged this evening for this panel to be surrounded by some of the most towering intellectuals that I look up to myself. I want to remind Carole Boyce Davies that we actually first met in Illinois in 1994 at the African Studies Conference, where the late Mudimbe was also a presenter, and Michelle Mugo, who is also late, was there. And it was my first time to it was my first time to attend an academic conference in the United States at Illinois. So you and I have known each other for 31 years. And of course, I've followed her work. I've even written a blurb about her book and all that kind of stuff. So we've been intellectual comrades for a long time. And Amina and I have known each other a little longer than I've known Carole. We first met when we were fairly young people in our early 30s. Shouldn't reveal our ages now. You know mine. And 70. I'm 70, yeah. So that was and that was in Kampala, when we were drawing up the CODESRIA, the Conference on Academic Freedom in Africa and Intellectual Responsibility, that led to that famous document, which was just revised 2 weeks ago in Dar es Salaam. Unfortunately, none of the three of us were there. In Kampala, we were the Young Turks. Now in Dar es Salaam would have been the Wazees, as they say in Swahili. I would like to answer Dr. Amina Mama's question in 5 ways. One, as a young kid in school, primary school, we were being taught, that's in the 60s, early 60s, we were being taught that our country had been discovered by David Livingstone. And he even named the lake, Lake Nyasa. Nyasa is Nyanja, which is lake, so it's kind of lake, which didn't make sense. And I remember as a kid saying, how could somebody discover us? Weren't our people already here? So I began to question the way we were being taught about our own past. And I think that sparked what became serious preoccupation with not only understanding our history, but also questioning the paradigms that are used to present that history. The second factor was that in college, I majored in both English and history. Then when I finished, I was offered positions in both departments to become a future lecturer in English or a future lecturer in history. My real passion was English, writing fiction. But then I said to myself, while it's nice to work on my real passion, it means I want to stretch myself. If I have to stretch myself intellectually, then let me go to history, because I'll be forced to actually read a lot more. In literature, I've spent time writing novels and short stories. Nothing wrong with that. So I decided to join the history department in order to stretch my own intellectual horizons. But of course, history and literature have very complex but productive intersections. They're both storytelling disciplines, but with very different protocols of producing scholarship. The other the third sort of impetus to be interested in history was, I was born in Zimbabwe, what is today Zimbabwe, then it was Rhodesia. My parents were migrants. The Southern African economies are very complicatedly interconnected through settler colonialism of that region. So families like mine are quite common. People from one country brought up in another country. Then we went back to Malawi, the home country of my parents, and I became I became preoccupied with questions of why there was such a difference in some cases. They were both colonial, but one was a settler colonial regime, and the other one was a kind of protectorate. In fact, it used to be called the Protectorate of Nyasaland. So why different types of colonialisms by the same imperial power with different implications for the African peoples? Of course, at one level, there are very common implications, but there are also some different implications. So why was Malawi so poor and underdeveloped? Why was Southern Rhodesia so oppressive to the African majority? The fourth factor was when I went to SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, and the London School of Economics, University of London, the doyen of African history, Roland Oliver, who was the first British lecturer in African history, used to welcome graduate students to his office individually. So you kind of go and kiss the ring, pay homage to the chief. So I remember my first encounter with him. He says, "You're coming from Malawi?" I said, "Yes." "Has anybody written on your tribe?" And I was immediately angry. I tend to be angry in terms of scholarship. Personally, I'm not an angry person. I found that extremely offensive. First of all, my parents come from two different ethnic groups. Secondly, I claim two different countries. So for me to be reduced to one ethnic group, to make a choice, and also then I said, how come the historians from Britain, from Canada, from the United States, can roam around Africa and study whatever they like? What prevents me from studying other African countries? So there and then, I decided not to study Malawi. I decided to do my master's on the economic history of Tanzania, specifically the sisal industry, which was a major part of the colonial economy. Then I became fascinated by Tanzania's neighbor to the north, Kenya. So decided to do my PhD on Kenya. That I thought would give me a comparative understanding of East African societies. And then finally, when I came to North America to stay in a way, I came to Canada, where I'd done my PhD in 1990. You remember that time. And I began to, in 1994 to be specific, Malawi underwent a democratic transition. Now, anybody who has been in quote-unquote self-imposed political exile, self-imposed at one level, you're always living with your suitcase half full, waiting for the day change happens and you go back home. So 1994, Malawi goes into democratic elections, and we have a new government after the 30-year dictatorship. In fact, that new government asked me to be a cabinet minister. And then it occurred to me, I'd actually developed a whole life in Canada. I had a family. So the suitcase was like, oh, maybe I need to empty that suitcase. I have a life here that I have built over the last 20-something years. And that got me thinking of myself no longer as somebody in self-imposed exile, but as a diasporan. And that also meant I began to be interested, and we'll talk later about this, into diaspora history. It meant I had to begin thinking about African history in its globality.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you want to follow up on that? No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I want to take you back to the moment you just mentioned when we first met and ask you what you recall from that conference that produced the Kampala Declaration on Academic Freedom. Because what I recall is that it was really a landmark moment. Many of us were encountering the African social science community for the first time. I think that was your situation. It was certainly mine. So it was a bit of a mind-blowing experience to be among the Tandikas, the Mamdanis, the Achimafejes, and all the first-generation academics. But they weren't terribly receptive towards us. So I would like to prod you. I would like to push you to say a little more about what transpired at that event.
Three memories sort of survive from my experience there. One was, just the experience of encountering these giants of African thought. Samir Amin, Tandika, Mamdani, Michere Mugo, and from Kenya, Wangari Maathai, and so on. And it was like, wow, being in their presence was so empowering and ennobling. Of course, we basically listened to them talk, Yeah, so that was that part. The second part was meeting people who became my lifelong friends, including you, Bayo, Mamadou Diouf at Columbia, and many others. We were then the young Turks, to use that phrase again, and we sort of bonded with each other, and we have maintained a lifelong personal and professional network of friendship and support, which becomes extremely important. For me, it was a lifesaver, because when I was at Trent in Canada, Dixon is sitting over there, he knows, I was the only black professor in the entire university, which meant that I was being asked everything about the African world. The whole content, no, in fact, the entire 1992, about Haiti, Baby Doc, Rodney King in Los Angeles, Chad, there was, so I had to respond to everything about. So it was very, very difficult to survive. I survived by mobilizing my network, which I had established at that Kampala conference. The third memory is, you remember we went to, or rather Museveni came to address us. And Museveni was supposed to be flying somewhere to West Africa. But of course, he sees himself as a kind of philosopher king, which he isn't. He ended up holding court with these towering African intellectuals for 5 hours. Yes. So we sat there listening to this man who's supposed to be telling us what to do and think and all that. So those are the three memories from that conference.
I can certainly share the memory of Museveni with his cowboy hat lecturing at the intellectuals. I mean, it was something he loved to do, partly because of his own history at Dar es Salaam. But we endured that. And I must say, we indulged him. First of all, he was invited to make the keynote. And second of all, that was Uganda's revolutionary moment. People were actually full of optimism about where Museveni's regime would go. But talking of regimes, I want to bring you back to what I think is one of your major works, which is the economic history of Africa, and ask you, in a sense, it's a difficult question, but since you committed to doing that work, and it was a landmark volume that is now quite a few years old, it won the 1994 Noma Award for African Publishing, I noticed that you're currently contracted to work on the volume 2. So the question I have for you is to invite you to talk about why you've decided to do a second volume. Are you going to do it? And how has Africa's economic fate, what are the major changes that have taken place in the intervening years?
First of all, the writing of that book was accidental, which may sound a little strange. When you look at intellectual history, knowledge producing processes. There are really 4 dynamics that influence what you do. The first one is, of course, the prevailing intellectual debates. Secondly, is the institutional context, whether there are departments or fields of centers and resources dedicated to a particular form of study. The third is ideological, the kinds of broad political and ideological debates that are taking place. The fourth is individual. This is what I call the 4 I's: institutional, intellectual, ideological, and individual. All of us, in a sense, when we do scholarship, there is a strong autobiographical element in the sense that that's what fascinates us for very complicated personal reasons. The genesis of that study was one day I went to a high school in Kingston, and there was this young woman, 15, 16, and she asked me a question to say, how did Africans do their economies before colonization? My PhD was on colonial capitalism in Kenya. I had not really seriously studied in a systematic way pre-colonial. By the way, I don't like using that term. African economies in earlier centuries. And of course, being a lecturer, I fumbled my way. I don't think they could tell that I didn't know what I was talking about. But that question troubled me. And then when I went to Kenya, basically the same year, 1984, they had recruited 2 new historians, myself and somebody, a British person, who was going to teach economic history. That person was late in coming, so the chair of the department said, Paul, can you teach African economic history? I said, yes. And I intentionally focused much of that course in trying to answer that student. The pre-colonial period, or the 19th century, more specifically. And then my students at Kenyatta would say, I start all my classes, every student who was taking a class with me know, I study every field with the historiography of that field. How has knowledge, paradigms, perspectives, opinions, and so on, frameworks, methodologies, theories been created for that field? And then, of course, I did that, and the student said, Prof, you're always attacking these people. Why don't you write your own book that can get us to actually read what you think is the truth? So I said, these young people are actually right. And then mentioning Codesria again, Codesria had a fellowship in 1990 called Reflections on Development. I applied for that fellowship after teaching in Kenya for 6 years, and I got that fellowship, which allowed the people who got the fellowship to go anywhere they wanted and sit for a while to think through and write whatever topic they chose. And I decided to answer not only the Jamaican student, but my Kenyan students by working on that book.
I was going to ask, sort of related practically, the logic of having been at several different universities, both on the continent, in the Caribbean, and also in the US, of course, and Canada as well, gave you as well a whole other global framework, I think, for looking at intellectual operations at those places. Can you say a little bit about that, perhaps?
Yes. It's, somebody gave a wonderful presentation earlier on today about travel, as well as, of course, the keynote speaker, Fumi, also talked about that. There is power, intellectual power, that you can derive, not all the time, but that you can derive from travel, from occupying different intellectual, political, and economic geographies. In Britain, I was a post-colonial, an ex-colonial. I come to Canada, I was a visible minority. My Canadian friends know that. That's the terminology used for us. And we were outside the national conversation, because in Canada, it's really the three solitudes: the French, the English, and the indigenous people. Then I went to Jamaica. I was elevated to this paragon of Africa, a brother from the continent. In fact, I learned public speaking in Jamaica because I was invited to address all sorts of communities. The Rastas would invite me, the Press Society of Jamaica would invite me, Lions Club would invite me to talk about Africa, and that was the time of the cricket tour. I went to Jamaica in 1982. The cricket tour had just happened, the Rebel cricket tour. So Africa was really hot. And then the liberation movements in South Africa would come there. Because I was the only African at the university, I would bring them to my house, you know. So I began to be forced to think of Africa as a continent, away from thinking of Africa in terms of regions and so on. And I think that was invaluable, because I then began to realize that a lot of people write books about Africa when they are talking about their village. Exactly. Or the little place they went to, and then they say Africa. So in that book, I intentionally, if you look at it, I have on every section examples, historical developments from Egypt to South Africa, from Somalia to Senegal. And that would not have happened if I had not had this experience of seeing Africa as a particular historical geography.
Right. I was going to say, though, just before we move, that you were in the middle, too, of the start of the Grenada Revolution. Yes. In that 1982 era.
Yes. I remember Maurice Bishop. He came to Mona, our campus in Jamaica, a month before he was assassinated. And Maurice Bishop was this absolutely charismatic. I mean, we were all literally eating out of his palms. The brilliance of his analysis of the Caribbean condition, the brilliance of his political agenda about the need for liberation of the Caribbean, about the need for solidarity between the Caribbean and Africa, the Caribbean and South America, about the need for global solidarity of all peoples fighting for liberation. It was amazing. And then we heard a month later he had been assassinated. And it was collective mourning on the entire campus. And unfortunately, Phyllis and Bernard Cord, who had him assassinated, were from Jamaica. And that was even more painful to deal with.
Yeah, I want to move to a different area, because one of my recollections of our earlier meeting was that there were some differences. And what I remember about you is that you stood in solidarity with Aisha Imam and myself when we raised the gender question at Codestria, which I think it had not been really raised very much before. So there was quite a lot of reaction to it. And then in the negotiations over the Kampala Declaration, there was quite a little bit of struggle over us wanting the language to become gender inclusive, which it partly did and partly didn't. The text is actually inconsistent. Sometimes it's he, his, the legal convention. Occasionally they put he, she, and occasionally it puts they. But what I remember is your solidarity and the fact that you were not afraid of feminism. which was set you apart from certainly the older generation and indeed quite a lot of the next generation, the younger generation. They have this absolute fear and tendency to refute the possibility that feminists can be African or that Africans can be feminists. And in your writing, apart from the essay that Carole mentioned, in which you do a thorough critique of the Western domination of African women's studies, African feminist studies. In another essay, The Gender Biases in African Historiography, you actually excavate all the major volumes on African history and go through them page by page, noting their extreme omission of the female half of the population and their complete inattention to gender issues. But I want to ask you, what was it in your life that made you different? Because you were clearly different from most of the men in that environment at that time, which sets you way ahead of them. It was as if you were anticipating things. But what made you different? Why weren't you afraid?
Okay, I wasn't afraid because I wasn't afraid of my mother. I loved my mother. I loved my grandmother. I come from a matrilineal society. And while colonialism destabilized a lot of practices, a lot of values associated with that kind of society, there are certain cultural elements that have survived. One of which is as simple as, how do you identify where you come from? In my family, we all the kids, we identify, we come from. When people say, where do you come from? What they mean is, where are your parents? What's their lineage? Because, I was born in Harare, so and we always mention my mother's area of origin, because that is part of the remnant of tracing descent through the female line. I've only been to my father's home district, where he originated, twice in my life. One when I was 5 years old, and the other one a year before he died in 2014. My mother's, all the time. My mother's relatives are far more important in my head than my father's relatives. My mother's are the real relatives. The other ones are, pretend relatives. So I think that element must have had an impact on how I think about men and women and their relationships. So for me, it was not a leap of faith to identify and understand that African women lost tremendous amount of power with colonialism, particularly in matrilineal societies. And then, of course, I became a father with my daughter, whom I adore, and my wife, whom I adore. And if anybody knows my wife and my daughter, know that I don't get away with anything. There are people that I truly share and learn from all the time. So, in other words, I grew up with tremendous respect for female members of my family, and that made that translation from that attitude, from that upbringing, into understanding the importance of gender analysis, as well as the importance of recovering the invisibilized voices, experiences, practices, ideals, visions, challenges, problems of women being important.
But taking to the political level, one of the points you make, and I found that fascinating, that you are not satisfied with the idea of the one-off president I mentioned earlier in speaking. That we are often told that, if you can have one person, then that's fine, but the logic of parity still stays unaccomplished. Yeah. And I was taken by the report you did. You indicated one of 9 members.
In fact, the two of us
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there were two men. This was the United Nations
Right.
Research Institute for Social Development. They wanted to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the
After Beijing, right.
conference. Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So it would be amazing to speak to how do you see those accomplishments as part of a process then that was started then? What would you say about that?
I want to add, especially given that, we're now 30 years forward, and although there's now, I don't think anyone would try to say that there wasn't a large body of African feminist scholarship because it's flourished and grown, yet nonetheless, the majority of men still seem to be very timid when it comes to addressing gender issues. And given what you've said about your, the psychology really of gender in your own case, I mean, that's true of many others.
Yes,
So I'm still not understanding the reticence of other men. So I wonder if you'd like to comment on that and what might be done to stop us continuing as if we're on parallel tracks and not communicating. How might you encourage our colleagues to be less reticent and more willing to do, for example, collaborative projects?
Right. I think we, the male scholars who believe in feminism, have to talk to our fellow men, which I try to do. We have a responsibility to do that. And that means correcting each other when we make certain sexist and misogynist type of remarks, but also analysis. We have to challenge each other for much higher levels of historical reconstruction, social understanding. Because if you ignore half the population, I mean, frankly, that's stupid. You're not going to understand anything, even about the men themselves. So I think the challenge is the challenge should not be put on the women. Just like the challenge of trying to get rid of racism should not be put on black people. Should be put on the ones who are practicing those things. I think there's a much larger question that we need to tackle. One of the things that has happened in the academy is, I think, the devaluation of why feminist scholarship, whether you're talking about Africa and even places like here in the United States and elsewhere, is undergoing a crisis. And part of that has to do with the institutional devaluation of the humanities and social sciences. And of course, the emphasis on STEM. I don't have to convince anybody, the data is very clear. Numbers of students graduating with history degrees is much lower today than 10, 15, 20 years ago. And you can run across. And most administrations don't really care about the humanities and social sciences. In Africa, it's even worse. I was giving a talk at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to ministers of finance and development, giving the Adebayo Adedichi annual lecture. And I was emphasizing the importance of the humanities and social sciences. And a minister from one country said, "Professor, those are useless disciplines. In fact, anybody who wants to study that should pay higher tuition than the ones who want to do STEM." Then, of course, I defended the humanities and social sciences very vigorously, that there is no contradiction between studying physics and fashion, studying history and nuclear engineering, that people have to understand the society that they're going to work in, whatever career. It's in the liberal arts, we develop intercultural skills, intellectual curiosity skills, the international skills, thinking, all the critical things. And in fact, the humanities and social sciences are more important today than they have ever been. Because AI is going to take over all these other things. But it may not take over our capacity to relate with each other as human beings. So for me, the challenge is partly a structural challenge that we have to handle. There is also an ideological challenge that many societies, including this one here, as well as on the continent, there's been a backlash against the limited progress that was made by the women's movement. Just like we've seen a backlash against the limited advances by the civil rights movement. And then there is the intellectual decline of radical paradigms. When we were going to school and beginning our careers, radical paradigms were the in thing to do. Marxist dependency, all these post-colonial theories, which were really critical about the discursive architecture of knowledge at that time. Now, a lot of those paradigms have gone into decline. And universities have become factories of conservatism. And that feeds into and amplifies the challenges that radical paradigms, such as feminism and others, tend to face. And then finally, the costs of being backward intellectually have fallen. Because all of us respond to incentives of one type or another. If you wanted to get published, when we were starting our careers, you really had to do very radical scholarship. Because most of the journals and all that was the in thing. But now there are all these, doing that, in fact, will penalize you. So the architecture, the infrastructure of knowledge production, including publishing, reward systems, is not one that is conducive to radical scholarship. And this feeds into the anti-feminist agendas because there is, the price you're going to pay for that is rather low compared to 20, 30 years ago.
Wow. So we have like 15 minutes. And we have two more topics I think you'd like to go with. I don't know if you want to combine them or...
Yeah, we try and combine them because I think they are kind of related. They're to do with the fact that you've become, as you said yourself, a diasporan, and you've lived in the diaspora for so many years. And this has been a major preoccupation of your engagement. One might say, and not just in terms of the volumes that he's written on the African diaspora, the global African diaspora, but also in concrete ways. And this is where we see Zeleza, the activist. We were aware of the endless draining, we used to call it the brain drain of African intellectuals to the north and to the west. And the fact, you became aware of the fact that there was a whole new generation of African scholars based in the West. And I'm referring to your work with the Carnegie Corporation, where you set up the Carnegie African Diaspora program, which was a way of returning some of the, if you like, the intellectual capital of the African diaspora to the continent. And that was a very concrete response to a structural problem, which was hugely significant. And you came up with the term brain mobility or brain circulation. So instead of it being a one-way street, but all of this speaks to your commitment to connecting the diaspora with the continent. And maintaining a vibrant connection. So you've done very practical things in that way. Yet when it comes to realizing the radical epistemological potential of contact between the diaspora and the continent, it seems to me that there's currently not enough debate between, say, the Black radical tradition here and the revolutionary Pan-Africanists on the continent, who are not really occupying the universities. A lot of them are at the fringe. Pan-Africanism is not alive and well in the neo-colonial academy. So the radical potential of mobilizing those networks and those circuits of thinkers seems to me to still have some way to go. So as leading scholars, including yourself and indeed myself, continue to find ourselves diasporas, how do you see the future transnationalization of African intellectuals being advanced, sort of following up on the Carnegie Project. What more needs to be done, and what is the potential for a global African knowledge agenda in that?
Yeah, if I can add to that, though, and what you said just sparked something else, the Black radical tradition. Where would we locate African scholars there, too? Maybe if you can add that to that.
Right,
part,
right.
that'd be amazing.
So first of all, I think in terms of the Carnegie program goes back to relationships developed through Codestria. This is why the networking is important. And I want to mention one particular individual who was mentioned, who was in the video last night, and that is Tade Aina. So Tade Aina and I have been friends from the Codestria days, from 1991, when he became editor at Codestria. In fact, he's the one who published, Manufacturing African Studies. And Tade and I talk a lot. Anybody who knows Tade is a generator of ideas. And we joke that we used to have an annual date to meet at the Zimbabwe International Book Fair every year, and would spend sometimes up to 4 o'clock in the morning talking. And Tade then went to work for the Ford Foundation. And in 2002, I was in Nairobi, and we were having tea. And the Ford Foundation had brought a group of Indians of African descent called the Sidis to East Africa, Tanzania and Kenya. And then Tade said, my brother, have you thought doing a comparative analysis of the diaspora in the Indian Ocean world and the Atlantic world? That idea was planted. It took 3 years for it to ferment. And in 2005, I decided to actually pursue that. And of course, Tade had access to institutional funds, gave me a grant, not him personally, the Ford Foundation, to undertake a visit to 16 different countries around the world. That resulted in the book In Search of African Diasporas: South America, the Caribbean, Europe, Asia, and so on. And then Tade goes to work for the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And then he said, my brother, you've done that global scoping. How about trying, us to understand ourselves as academics? So he says, why don't you do a project on the African academic diaspora in North America, Canada, and the United States? So I did that. I had a research assistant. We interviewed, a lot of Africans, African-born, and then we set up, after that, the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship, program. And the ambition has been that we should expand that into what we are calling the Carnegie African Diaspora Scholars Consortium. Because the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship program deals with African-born. And I remember you, my sister.
Accidentally born in the diaspora.
Yeah, I know. We had a long conversation about that. And the other one we are trying to create is to include the entire diaspora. The historic diasporas, people like my daughter who are born here. We have to think about that as a group. Now, how do we build partnerships? I think we have to do it in a number of ways. First of all, it has to be through the curriculum. The curriculum in Africa, many African countries, needs to do a couple of things, which is absolutely imperative. One, take the teaching of African history seriously. It's not the case, by the way. Two, take the teaching of global Africa seriously, which is even worse than the first one in terms of lack of... And the second is what we learned from the last panel. Media. Really looking very carefully at media platforms, because those are avenues that a lot of our people get their information, their opinions, their perspectives, and a lot of them wrong. Both the legacy media as well as the new media. So we have to take very seriously that arena. And then, again, somebody presenting today was talking about the arenas of connectivity. How do we engage each other? That research from the team from Michigan State. How do we engage each other in our educational institutions? For example, at Howard, we have students coming from all over the diaspora and the continent. What are their relationships? Because those are opportunities for serious intellectual and personal engagement. The spaces of work, the social, economic, and cultural spaces, the church, the mosque, the shrine, whatever your cup of tea is in terms of religion. Our participation in political processes. How do we engage each other? Our interpersonal relationships. How do we build those relationships and ensure they are respectful and mutually supportive and mutually beneficial? And then finally, I think is the whole question of what I call mutuality of empowerment. How do we engage on the continent and in the diaspora in ways that reinforce progressive change rather than we become a fifth column for the exploitation and oppression of our own people? When we get African Americans looking at Africa, which regimes are they supporting? When we get Africans working with regimes in the global north, which regimes are they seem to be comfortable with? We have to raise the costs of disempowerment. And raising those costs, being mindful and being mutually engaged from a respectful vantage point, and understanding each other's histories, their complexities, their contradictions, their interconnections. There is a wonderful documentary done by a Kenyan filmmaker called Africans versus African Americans. So the people who are doing that research from Michigan, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. And it talks about, it brings a group of people, Africans and African Americans, to talk about their experiences. And one thing that comes out clearly is that they really don't have much interpersonal connections. They have not visited each other's homes. They may work together. And more importantly, we are both wounded on both sides of the Atlantic. And sometimes when you are wounded people, you take it out on your nearest relative. Wounded men take it out on their wives. Wounded communities take it out on the weakest members of that community. And as we heard in that presentation also, we are all scrambling for the limited spoils of the systems that are there. And we behave like crabs in a barrel, pulling each other down instead of pulling each other, or pushing each other up. So we have to be intentional in multiple spaces in building bridges. Not because we don't even have to like each other. Building solidarity is not about liking each other, but it's based on a strategic understanding that in advancing your cause, you need to build alliances with groups that have an investment for their own reasons in pushing that agenda. Now, it's even nicer if we like each other, and even better still, if we marry each other. I'm married to an African American, so you can understand why I'm saying that. But that's not a prerequisite. It has to be principled solidarity, not simply the solidarity that is exploitative, that I call paternalistic solidarity.
So I would take the liberty as chair of the session to say, let's please stand and acknowledge Dr. Zeleza, Professor Zeleza, and acknowledge him for his birthday. Formidable scholarship, personality, and joy to be in your company, in your presence. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being
Now
amazing.
I think we go partay.
Somebody,
Okay, thank you.
Okay, excuse me. Excuse me. All right, thank you all in this room and around the world for joining us to celebrate the 70th anniversary and the life work of Professor Zeleza. In these 2 days, we have heard inspiring presentations and discussions, insightful reflections on Professor Zeleza's scholarly work, informative testimonies on Professor Zeleza's familial and communal life, well-deserved appreciations of Professor Zeleza's leadership and contributions to the academy and beyond. Thank you all for joining us and helping celebrate Professor Zeleza's 70th birthday and showcasing key aspects of his immense contributions to the creation, curation, transmission, and implementation of knowledge. At this point, I would also like to remind us that the sponsors of this conference have been the Department of African Studies, the Center for African Studies, the Department of English, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership, and the Department of Political Science. And to finish, please allow me to present the organizing committee. They mandated me to not introduce them until the end so they can be, do their work. So please, when I call your name, members of the organizing committee, if you, of course, here, please rise to be recognized. One is Dr. Cassandra Vini. Dr. Vini is the director of the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership at Howard University. Two is Dr. Chambi Chachagi. Dr. Chachagi is an assistant professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. Three is Dr. Piwo Kule. I'm still struggling with his name. We call him Piwo. Nyandu. Okay, so for now, I'm gonna keep with Piwo because I don't wanna butcher his name. So, Nyandu, he is the assistant director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University. Ms. Imani Hopkins of the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. Ms. Anya Weno of the Center for African Studies. And last but not least, Mr. Aaron Jacobs of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center here at Howard University. So now we will be heading to the Center for African Studies for the reception. And since we are all going together, there is no need to give you the address, so we will go together. Thank you very much.